You start putting in little bits of duct tape and chewing gum and all sorts of little things that just keep things working, right? Because quite often you've got a product, you've got a business, you've got customers, you've got users. You want to keep things working and you want to address the most critical issues that people have. Often doing it the right way is prohibitively expensive. So you do it the not as right way.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Saad.
And today we're going to discuss the often misunderstood and quite mysterious topic of technical debt, what it means for you and your startup. So today we're going to cover the definition of technical debt. What even is it? Make it concrete by discussing what some of the types of technical debt are, understanding a bit more the metaphor of technical debt, like why do we call it debt? How does it relate to financial debt? Then we're going to talk about some of the extremes of technical debt to be avoided. And finally, we're going to talk about how to pay back technical debt and how to make sure that this whole topic is approached pragmatically with a business-first, customer-first lens, rather than as a divide between the technical side of the company and everybody else. This is a really important topic. I hope we can clear up some misconceptions and help you run your startup more smoothly. We're going to go through all of that right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's vanta.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, before we get started, we're going to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact, which says if you've listened to a few episodes of the show and gotten value, we only ask for a few things in return. Please subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Give us a review. Give us a shout out on your favorite social network. It helps us feed the algorithm and helps us grow the show and ultimately help more founders like you. All right, with that, let's jump into it. Let's learn all about technical debt.
We're talking today about technical debt. And Chris, I think a lot of the misunderstandings, a lot of the angst around technical debt starts because people don't really have a good understanding of what it even is. So let's start there. What is technical debt? Technical debt is what I think of as a type of entropy. It's a buildup of suboptimal situations in a code base, right? So this is something that's happening within the code that you've built. And it always starts off beautiful and pristine, but after time passes, you find, oh, there are all these things that don't line up with how we do business today, or they weren't built for scalability, or they don't have enough tests and things like that. And so one thing that I really wanted to make clear about technical debt before we go further is that it is inevitable. It can be managed, and we'll come back to that, but it's inevitable. Now, why is it inevitable? It's inevitable precisely due to evolving product and business requirements. We talk on this show endlessly, Chris, about learning, iterating, shipping thin slices, pivoting even, right? And what that means is the thing that you started out building and that you thought you were building, you've made a lot of changes to it along the way. The initial assumptions that you'd made when you started building the thing are no longer valid. And those false assumptions, the workarounds that you've built to sort of work around those assumptions and so on, those are technical debt, right? You've got all these legacy decisions. You've got all of these assumptions that are no longer true. You thought you were building X, but you're building Y. And all of this stuff builds up over time, right? You can imagine that if you start building a house, if you've traveled in developing countries, right? Someone's built a house and they're like, oh, let's put another room on the roof and stuff like that, right? Like the thing evolves from the original design. You've got pipes running along the outside. You've got exposed live wires. That's a sort of the physical manifestation of technical debt. But because software is so much easier to change than a house, it gets changed more. And that's why you end up with such a vast amount of this technical debt.
Yeah, and you touched on this idea that technical debt is going to happen. It's inevitable. And let's talk about that a little bit. So, in my advisory work, I'm always bumping into founders and CTOs and engineers who are trying to avoid technical debt. They're kind of overbuilding the thing, making it super future-proof, making it super flexible. I'm a bit guilty of this, for way too long in my career. You try to avoid tech debt by building some really powerful, flexible, and overbuilt thing. And as you said, Yaniv, that doesn't work for many, many reasons. The most important reason is that the best way to build a startup and to build a product is to put something small in the world and iterate over time. So by definition, your requirements are changing. By definition, your use cases are changing. By definition, you're learning more about the market as you build, ship, and iterate. And sometimes the market itself is changing underneath you. And so not only is tech debt okay, tech debt is part of the process of building your first viable product, your next viable iteration, on and on and on. It is impossible to avoid. There's a saying which is, if your first version isn't embarrassing, you've shipped too late. If you're not accruing tech debt, you are overbuilding and spending way too much time on technical choices instead of shipping fast and trying to get product market fit as fast as you can.
And we'll come back to a number of those points as we go through this, Chris. One thing that we'll come back to later, but I just wanted to touch on, is that metaphor of debt, which I think is valuable, right? Like, why is it called technical debt? It's called technical debt because you need to service it, and then ultimately you may choose to pay it back, right? So imagine financial debt, right? When you borrow money, you need to pay interest on that, right? Which means you've got less money to spend on yourself. And then if you want to stop paying interest on it, you actually have to start paying back the capital, which means you have to put more money into it. And that's the thing with technical debt, right? Is why is technical debt a problem if you have too much of it? It's because it slows you down. Everything you do becomes more difficult than it needs to be because you're spending more and more of your time, which is a valuable resource here, servicing the debt, dealing with all the issues that come from having technical debt, rather than building new features or doing what it is that you need to provide value to your customers. I'd love to jump in, Chris, to some of the common types of technical debt, because non-technical folks might still be listening and going, this all sounds very well, but it feels kind of abstract. So I wanted to make it a bit more concrete. The first type of technical debt is what I call domain misalignment. And that's what we've touched on, Chris, which is the idea that the product you have today is different from the product that you envisaged when you first started building it. And, if you have some amount of technical understanding, you know that you have databases with tables and they represent different business entities and so on, and relationships between them. And you build your software on top of a bunch of assumptions about these business entities and the relationships between them. For example, who your users are, how they relate to each other, all these things. And as your product evolves, you realize some of your assumptions were wrong. And so what happens is, sure, you could kind of throw out your database and start again and rewrite all the software, but that's not a good idea. So instead, you start adding little kludges, right? You're like, well, we thought each business only had one business unit in our initial assumption, but it turns out that our customers often have multiple business units. We didn't design for that. So we're going to put this little hack in place that means we can have multiple business units without rewriting all the software. And it works. But it's debt, because now every time you make a change to the software, you have to remember that the way you implemented this isn't clean, and you have to continue to service that workaround.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce this point though, Yaniv, because you're describing it as you might learn, or it might turn out that there's a difference in what the user needs. Very often this is a choice, right? You're like, we don't want to support multiple departments. This product is only designed for single department use for now, because we're building a minimum viable product. So I just want to stress that point, which is, the world is more complex than you're building for, and you're making that choice intentionally so you can ship something minimal, viable, and useful.
That's fair. Sometimes you'll know, sometimes you won't know. Either case, building a startup is fundamentally about working in a state of uncertainty. So you don't know a lot of things. And there are other things, to your point, that you might know, but you're not ready to implement yet. Either way, what happens is you need to take this amorphous idea you have and crystallize it, make it concrete in software. Sure, you might not know whether you're going to have more than one business unit or not, but right now you need to make a decision that is pragmatic for your business. And so you make that call. But by definition, if you're working in uncertainty and you're making a bunch of decisions and assumptions, a whole lot of them are going to work out to be wrong. That is not a bug. That is not a failure. That is a fact of nature, right? The reality of the situation here. So by definition, the domain that you started with, and domain in this technical sense means like this set of entities and relationships between them and the understanding of your customer base or the businesses that you're serving, is going to be wrong. It's going to be inaccurate. And you cannot blow it up and start again every time you realize you made a mistake. So instead, what do? You accumulate technical debt. Next common type of technical debt is lack of testing. So what happens when you're writing software is there is an easy way to write software and a hard way to write software. When you are first starting your startup, the software is fairly simple. It's in the head of one or two developers. It needs to be built really quickly, really cheaply, because you're testing and iterating and testing and iterating against the market. And so what that means is a lot of the good hygiene factors, for example, automated tests, are easy to not focus on, right? You're like, well, I could build this feature and ship it in 2 days, or I could build this feature and have automated test suites set up for it, and that's going to take me 2 weeks. Well, actually, it's a really sensible business decision to not do all of that. You cannot afford it. You don't have the time to write all these tests. And also, you might throw out all the tests because you're like, oh, we built the totally wrong thing and we're going to do something else anyway. So it's quite often that the hygiene factors around early code are sacrificed in favor of velocity. And that's actually the right thing to do. But what it means is later on, hopefully you've built a successful business off the back of this. Your startup is going strong. All of that early code, which turns out to usually be at the core, most fundamental part of your product, is going to have various inadequacies around the way in which it was architected, built, tested, and so on. Until you remedy that, it means everything that you do when you touch that code is going to be slower. Next common type of technical debt is quick fixes and shortcuts. At any point in time, you might be like, oh, okay, we really need to ship this feature. We promised it to a customer. Or there's this bug that is fairly business critical, and to fix it properly will take a month, but to fix it in a kind of hacky sort of way will take 1 day. So it's the right thing to do. And so you start putting in little bits of duct tape and chewing gum and all sorts of little things that just keep things working, right? Because quite often you've got a product, you've got a business, you've got customers, you've got users. You want to keep things working and you want to address the most critical issues that people have. Often doing it the right way is prohibitively expensive. So you do it the not as right way. And so over time, you build up this accumulation of technical debt of quick fixes and shortcuts. Final one for me for now is outdated architecture and technology. So again, I think this is sort of two related things. The first is that when you start, you shouldn't what's sometimes called gold plate your initial infrastructure. Don't build for 1 million users when you don't even have one user. You don't have the time, you can't afford it. It is a waste. Okay, so you build something that is suitable for a smaller scale, and then, God willing, your business goes well, right? You get a whole lot more customers, and that initial architecture starts to really creak and bend, and it's just not handling all of the volume of traffic and so on as well as it could do. So that's a real challenge. Related to that is that initial software you built, maybe it was 5 years ago, maybe it was 8 years ago. At a certain point, you're going to be running on old versions of the software, old versions of the database, maybe even old frameworks that are not getting the best maintenance, that have been superseded by others, and you're stuck with that. So that is also technical debt.
Yeah, technical debt everywhere. It comes in from all angles in all ways. But I think, the common thread, as we talked about at the beginning, Yaniv, is you are literally taking a loan in order to accelerate, to bring forward the money you need to get something done today, and you have to pay it off tomorrow. As we started to touch on, we're going to touch on this more later in the episode. Some of this debt is good debt, like maybe buying investment properties, and some debt is bad debt, like buying supercars. So the question becomes, which kind of debt are you taking on and for what reason?
Exactly. And I think that's actually at the core of what we want to talk about. So maybe let's jump straight to that topic to further understand that metaphor of technical debt. And exactly as you say, there's good debt and bad debt. So, there are ways in which technical debt is different to financial debt. To me, the biggest difference, before we go into all the similarities, is that technical debt is inevitable. I already touched on that, right, Chris? You can choose not to borrow money and not end up in financial debt. You cannot choose, if you're building a viable startup, not to have technical debt. So I think that's actually really important.
So actually, Yaniv, I want to press back on that a little bit. I think a lot of people are afraid of debt, financial debt. They believe that the cleanest, best way to living their life is to be debt free, and they don't want to bring forward or have any leverage in their lives. And I would argue that is not actually a successful way to live your life. That is a way to live a fairly small life without achieving any kind of leverage. And I'm talking about the good kind of debt. And I think the same thing is true in businesses, software businesses, where people think that technical debt is a bad thing and they want to optimize for zero technical debt. And again, here I'd argue that is a great way of building a very small business typically. It's not optimizing for product market fit, for growth, for experimentation, for venture scale outcomes, which of course is what we're interested in this podcast. And so just like If you don't want to try to achieve some kind of financial freedom, invest, have leverage in your life, you can choose to have no debt, but it will be a smaller life. And same with business. If you don't want to take on debt in your technical choices in your business, you maybe can do that, but you'll have a smaller, if not failing business.
Yep, there we go. So there's a little bit of financial life advice as a bonus for this episode. Agree. I guess the point I'm making here is, okay, technical debt is inevitable, but in other ways, it is very much like financial debt. And in particular, Chris, as you know, there is good debt and bad debt. Now, what do we mean by good debt and bad debt? Here's the way I would think about it. Good debt is debt that provides a positive future return, right? In other words, if by saving a month in shipping a new feature today, you're able to bring forward your product market fit and therefore beat the competition and grow your ARR faster, such that in future you've actually got a really big business, you're able to raise money and so on, then that's probably debt worth taking on if the alternative was to move too slowly and miss the opportunity. Similarly, we talk about the iteration cycle, the iteration cycle time, right? How long does it take to get an experiment in market, learn and iterate? So if you gold plate these things and each one of these iterations takes 2 months, you get 6 cycles a year. If you kind of take some shortcuts, you take on technical debt, but that means that you can get each of these experiments out in 2 weeks instead of 2 months. Instead of doing 6 experiments a year, you're doing 26 experiments a year. The compounding on your learning is going to be epic, right? So this is very, very, very good debt. You want to take that debt because it's the difference between having a massively successful business, albeit one with some technical debt, and a failed business with very little technical debt, which is completely pointless, right? So the business value is really high. And I think that is what we mean by good debt. It is debt that ultimately leads to a higher return than the cost of servicing it. So what's bad debt? Because there is bad technical debt. And bad technical debt, in my view, is technical debt that is unnecessary, that is accumulated without serving a purpose. Let's just say you hire a developer, a software engineer who's not very good at their job, right? So when they build something, even within the constraints of like the time available, you can do a better job or you can do a worse job. You can ship something that is just really badly architected that's going to come back and bite you later. You're being careless. Or sometimes this manifests as a less technical leader, a less technical founder who's just like, hey, I've just seen that demo that you built just as an internal prototype. Let's just ship that thing right now as it is. Like it looks like it works, but because it was really just built as a prototype, it doesn't have any architectural rigor to it at all. And it starts to become a really heavy technical debt without realizing it. And so, I think there are various kinds of bad technical debt, but Chris, there's one thing that they always have in common, which is bad technical debt is unintentional. Good technical debt is intentional. What do I mean by that? If you're accumulating technical debt and you haven't made a commercial decision to say this debt is worth taking on, then you probably shouldn't be taking it on, right? Technical debt is a tool in the same way as financial debt is a tool. It can be a powerful tool for growing your business. But if you're not using it as a tool, you're just kind of accumulating it sloppily and carelessly. It's the equivalent of an individual living off their credit card, living beyond their means.
Credit card debt, yeah.
Exactly right. They're not borrowing money and investing it in income generating assets that produce capital gains and dividends in excess of the interest rate or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve by taking on debt. No, it's just like, oh, I wanted to get another freaking pumpkin spice iced latte with hazelnut at Starbucks and then put it on the credit card even though I can't afford it, even though I don't need it, even though it's bad for my health. I'm just doing it anyway. So the distinction with good technical debt and bad technical debt ultimately comes down to, am I doing this intentionally, mindfully, in alignment with my business goals, or am I just doing it carelessly, thoughtlessly, ignorantly? And that is really the core of it.
I think the audience would be really disappointed with me if I didn't put this little plug in. You have to make sure that your business goal, again, if you're talking about venture scale startups, is sustainable growth toward, product market fit versus, we'll take on this white label enterprise customer and turn ourselves into a technology-backed services company. The intentional good reason to take on debt is to accelerate towards product market fit and growth. Bad reasons are to doing it unintentionally, accidentally, or to do it in service of some dead-end project that's thrashed, that the CEO brought in because they did some biz dev deal for a white label development project. So you have to make it really, really intentional and good intention. You have to understand what is a good intention versus a distraction.
And in fact, a little side note inspired by what you said there, Chris, and kind of a corollary to the fact that technical debt is inevitable. Any software you build, any new feature that you build is a form of technical debt, right? Like code itself attracts technical debt. And so I think that's one of the things that it can be really easy for CEOs, for non-technical leaders to miss, is that every bit of software that you ship has not just an upfront cost attached to it, right? It's not just the cost to build it. You've got an ongoing maintenance cost. You've got an ongoing increase of complexity that represents technical debt. So every bit of software you put out into the world has CapEx, but it also has OpEx. And the OpEx isn't just your cloud fees, folks. Your true OpEx is servicing the technical debt on that software that you've built. And that is a very much a phantom cost that can strangle your business.
Yeah, this is the fourth bullet you have in the common types of debt at the beginning of the episode, right? Outdated architecture and technology. Code starts to decay as soon as it gets put into production. Actually, before it starts getting put into production. And so, yeah, that cost, that debt you're paying is, as you said, the CapEx and the OpEx. You need to be making that choice intentionally, and your intentions need to be in the right place.
But it's really easy to miss, right? And then you end up in a situation where the founder's like, why can't we ship anything anymore? Why is our product and engineering team moving so slowly? The answer is because it's strangled by technical debt. And one of the ways it gets strangled by technical debt is by being this sort of featureitis, feature factory, where it's just like build more things, never simplify, right? So it generally results in a messy product surface, but it also results in a messy code backend that is really difficult to maintain. And therefore, more and more of the time goes into maintenance and less into building new stuff. So you literally grind to a halt if you're not careful of this. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. I wanted to talk about the two extremes of technical debt. We've touched on this a bit already, Chris, so I think we can go through this relatively quickly. But I think the sort of two things that people tend to jump to, right? The first is avoiding technical debt completely. And you've already gone on your little financial advice there, Chris, like avoiding debt completely anywhere it's a miss, right? Because debt is a tool. It is a powerful tool that can accelerate your outcomes. It's rocket fuel, it's leverage, right? You don't want to avoid technical debt completely. But how does it happen? It generally actually happens when you have a very strong voice for engineering. I've been guilty of this, okay? And I've seen people who are much guiltier than me as well. Which is you say, you know what, we're building software. We want to be a unicorn one day. So we better build a strong foundation. It often comes down to words like strong foundation. Make sure that we have good architecture, good software engineering, make the software scalable, maintainable, clean, readable. All of these things are very positive. As an engineer, these all like set off little bits of dopamine of in my head. I'm like, this is good stuff, right? But the problem is if you overweight that perspective, that technical perspective of like, what does it take to build a beautiful piece of software? What you're forgetting is that all software that you build in a startup must be in service of the goals of that startup, right? It's no good to have software that its aesthetic beauty is an end in itself. And what it means is doing things right always costs more. It costs more time in particular when you're talking about building software. And time is your most valuable resource. I think we've done whole episodes on this, Chris. So, I think sometimes what you need to do is make sure that your engineering team, and this can also spill over to your design and your product team, are really pragmatic, that they are business oriented, that they're like, what is the long-term goal that we're shooting for? And what are the costs that we're incurring by sitting here in our ivory tower or on our high horse, whatever your metaphor is, and insisting on quality that frankly we cannot afford at this time?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, Yaniv. In my early career, I was very, very technical. I came from a programming background. I don't say engineering because I didn't go to school for it, but I used to program. I used to know how some of these underlying principles worked, and I would be obsessed with not just the user experience. In fact, I was underinvested in the user experience, and I'd be really obsessed with the architecture of the software and how we could make it this beautiful, elegant, reusable, multi-purpose Swiss Army knife. That would be future-proof and configurable and adapt itself to many use cases. And so in essence, I was acting like this overzealous CTO instead of a business person and a product leader. What I learned at pretty much Uber was the one that really shone a bright light at it for me is like all of these world-class engineers and product managers were happy to take on tons of technical debt in order to ship something discreet, simple, pragmatic, and useful. anytime I was trying to like overgeneralize, they'd be like, "Hey, no, wait, we don't need to generalize it like that. It's perfectly fine. We can refactor that service later to make it a bit more generalized if and when we need to." That was a real wake up call for me. I was like, "Wow, this is a completely different philosophy," and I totally get it, because the paramount consideration is time to market, value delivery to the customer, and efficacious use of the runway. It's such an easy mistake to make. I meet so many founders. I have advised so many founders who are just wrapped around the axle around how elegant the software is, how future-proof the software is. Is it scalable? And there's this kind of a 90s obsession with, will it scale? And I'm like, guys, have you ever heard of like AWS and serverless backends? Like, everything scales. You get scale for free. Let's just focus on what the features are.
I've got to disagree with you on that, but it's not really the point. You don't get scale for free.
You get most of the scale you need pre and shortly after post product market fit,
That's the point.
basically for free. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
you really need to focus on that end user experience and getting something thin out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes jokingly call this engineers gone wild. It's very different from salespeople gone wild. Salespeople gone wild is an HR incident. Engineers gone wild is, let's use the latest architectural framework and make sure it's using domain-driven design and perfectly tested, and we have this beautiful release process. And it's a funny way of going wild, but what I mean by that is you've lost control of the why. Why are we building any of this software in the first place? It becomes inward gazing, and that can be really dangerous. And yes, anybody with a technical background can be susceptible to this. And, I've certainly made that mistake. Let's talk about the opposite, which is ignoring technical debt completely. You're like, oh, okay, I understand leverage and whatnot. But more than that is, like I said, it's this ignorance of technical debt. This is the one that tends to bite less technical founders. Again, it starts from the right place, which is, hey, let's focus on building and shipping. Oh, you've presented this internal demo. That looks cool. Let's ship it next week. Oh, I've just promised it in a sales call to our major client, this prototype that you built. So now we have to get it to market, right? And what happens here is you're building in such a hurry and you're doing such a shitty job of building that you end up sooner rather than later grinding to a halt, right? You're taking on technical debt so quickly. To use that financial debt analogy, you are using your entire cash flow, your entire income, which in this case is time, just servicing the debt. You're just keeping the lights on. Your engineers are keeping the lights on this like really dodgy edifice. They've got no time to build anything new. And in any case, building something new on top of something that is encumbered by technical debt is itself more expensive. And so you end up in this situation where you're moving fast, stop moving, right? And it can catch up with you really quickly. The real anti-pattern I see here is when you finally get to the point where the technical debt is strangling you and the engineers are like feeling that heat, like, why aren't you shipping as quickly? And they say, we have a lot of technical debt. And the founder says, that's just an excuse. I'm going to fire the head of engineering. And like this technical debt is used as an excuse because if you don't understand what technical debt is, so in a sense, this episode is for you, non-technical, less technical founder. Technical debt is real. The problem is often people kind of see it used as this cover-all excuse and they don't buy it. And it can cause real tensions between the product or the business side of the startup and the development side of the startup.
That's like looking at your bank account, your home loan account, or and go, oh, that's just numbers on a website. That's not real. And it's real. You owe the bank the interest payment on that. For my money, I like, the ideal case is that technical debt is being paid off as and when you're rethinking certain parts of the system. So as I said, let's say for sake of argument, using microservices, you need to adjust how some piece of the thing works. Ideally, you're refactoring that microservice to continue to be a clean implementation of the latest understanding of the problem. You're accruing technical debt in the sense that you're moving quickly and that your requirements change often, but that you revisit the service, you revisit the code, and you refactor as you go. That is the ideal. But most companies, most of the time, they get way past that point, and then they look back and there's just a complete giant mess. They're going to have to solve that and to make a concerted effort against that.
Well, it was funny. You were sort of talking about, not realizing the numbers in the bank account are real, Chris. And I'm sort of thinking of having a child, a child in the 21st century never sees cash. All they do is they see you using this magic plastic card that lets you pay for things. And if you give a kid this card, they'll like spend and spend and spend, and suddenly the card will stop working. And they're like, why did the card stop working? They never saw the numbers behind it, right? They didn't realize that there were numbers behind it. And it's nearly like that's what's happening with non-technical folks. They don't understand that actually every time you're building software quickly or whatever, or you're simply accumulating, the passage of time is increasing entropy, that this is something that needs to be paid back and that it's finite. It's just that understanding is missing. You've already touched, Chris, on paying back technical debt. And, I think this is a really interesting challenge, right? Because there's never a good time to pay back technical debt. No matter what stage you're at a business, there's always so much to be done, right? There's so much stuff that feels like, oh, if I spend this capital, this time on doing something customer facing, then it will add value. Whereas if I just pay back technical debt, then I don't feel like I'm gaining anything, right? The product stays the same. We've done some refactoring, we've added tests, we've done some database migrations, we've done some infrastructure upgrades, we've done some latency improvements, whatever. The business person's eyes sort of glaze over because that is not delivering value, but it's a necessity. And so I nearly feel that the way you think about paying back debt is, it needs to happen. And so when you are, and Chrissy sort of touched on this, when you're taking on the debt, you need to make some sort of agreement on when is the right time to pay it back. But also, I would say that once you reach a steady state, now I'm talking to people who are working at, say, scale-ups, companies that are past Series A, product market fit, they have customers, they have a certain amount of money, either through revenue or capital raising, they're not on a razor's edge financially anymore. What you should do is you should devote a fixed amount of your engineering resource to paying back technical debt. Rule of thumb might be 20% of your time should be paying back technical debt and general maintenance. And, this is the same thing as in finances, that you should save money first, right? Before you spend it all. If you've got a mortgage, you should pay off your mortgage first. And so there's this idea, you need to be attacking the principal all the time, because if you're just serving the interest, right, the entropy cost, soon enough, the interest is going to basically swallow you up whole. And sometimes our final point, Chris, is going to be sort of the decision-making frameworks around technical debt. I think you should still have discipline around this as a use of the business's resources. But if you don't think to yourself, I need to pay myself first, I need to work on paying back that technical debt so I'm well set up for the future, you're going to end up in real trouble. And so the really important thing to do here is to understand, again, educate from early on all the leaders that technical debt is a real thing and that technical debt, when taken on, will need to be paid back later.
Yeah, so I often act as a fractional chief product officer for scale-ups. There's a sizable product team, they're looking for product leadership and strategy. Oftentimes, as they've achieved product market fit, they're understanding the size and scope and shape of their product. It actually, during my tenure, the time to pay off some of that technical debt comes due. I actually find that quite cathartic. Again, I have a technical background, so I enjoy designing those next generation systems. But the trick is almost always to avoid trying to build a second parallel system that is feature complete that you will then one day cut over to. That almost never happens because the first system is constantly improving or changing, and it's like trying to hit a moving target. You disappear for 1, 2, 3, 5 years. It's always 2 or 3 times the time that it takes the engineers estimate, and it's just a fucking disaster. And so again, you really want to be refactoring parts of the system along some plan so that by the time you're done, you've kind of lifted and shifted each part and you've put each step into production as you go. It's very exciting. It means your company has achieved some amount of product market fit. You understand the future to some degree of certainty, and you can now consolidate multiple code bases and multiple kludgy patches and hiccups and leaks springing everywhere. And I'm actually going through that right now, and it's a hell of a lot of fun because you get to really re-examine the problem from first principles and understand how to build something that's really, really elegant.
It can be fun. And sounds like you've got a supportive leadership team there, Chris. Like, I think one of the things that I've seen be a problem when I've consulted elsewhere and so on is that you get to this point where you're like, okay, you've taken on this technical debt to reach product market fit. Things are starting to hum along. That payments on that debt come due, but the leadership don't realize that. The leadership says, oh, we've got the product market fit. Now it's time to put the foot on the gas. And we've got this crowded roadmap of stuff we need to do. And that crowds out paying back the technical debt. And worse than that, what it means is because you have all that technical debt and suddenly this insanely ambitious roadmap, the toll that technical debt will take in developing that roadmap is going to be really significant. And you will tend to see features delayed in their launch, just not as much happening, a kind of sense of it's hard to get stuff done. We're walking through mud. That mud is the technical debt that you thought you couldn't afford to pay back because you've got so much to build. So there's never a right time to pay back technical debt. It can be fun, it can be rewarding, but it needs such broad buy-in from the entire team to say, this is a business priority, right? This is not engineering going, just having a bit of a whinge, a bit of a sook. No, this is a business priority. If we want to be able to hit our goals, if we want to put our foot down on the gas, we better change the fucking oil on this thing or it's just going to blow up.
It is a supportive executive team, but the support doesn't come from nowhere, right? So this is after many, many months of me working through the team and restructuring the business strategy, the product strategy, the org structure, radically reducing the number of focus areas, not radically, but incrementally increasing resourcing to properly fit the mission, and also framing the technical debt as imperative to certain business outcomes. It might be uptime, it might be velocity, it might be unlocking new features and new markets through unified code bases and offerings. And so there's an awful lot of deep consultative and consensus building work that I've done with the company in particular I'm thinking of, to get the executive team not just to be okay with the technical debt payoff, but to be enthusiastic about it. And there is sufficient people in the team now with sufficiently narrow scope of business priorities that we can both pay off technical debt while delivering new feature capabilities to the market. And so we're actually doing both. And it's a very exciting time.
Oh, that's really exciting. Well done, you. Folks, you should hire Chris. So the final discussion topic I wanted to use to bring this all together, Chris, is what's the decision-making framework? We've talked about technical debt. We've talked about the fact that it's inevitable, but that also there are decisions that you should make. There's good debt. There's bad debt. You need to pay back debt. These are all decisions that you need to be making about technical debt, right? And how do you avoid the engineers gone wild? Because another thing that can happen, sorry, as an aside, is that engineers gone wild can also happen when paying back technical debt. You can say, oh, now's the time for paying back technical debt. And every engineer is going to come up with their pet peeve that they want to address. I want to refactor this. I want to upgrade that. I want to use this new framework. Well, this is how you decide whether it is actually worth doing, right? And it all comes down to, as you said, Chris, thinking of technical debt like you think of any other business decision. You have to remove it from the realm of being a purely technical decision made purely by technical people into a business decision, right? And what that means is you need to be thinking about assessing the impact, the commercial impact of taking on technical debt, and then later on, the decisions you make around paying it back. You need to be thinking ROI, right? Radio over internet. That's what it stands for, right?
I've never even heard of that before.
You've not watched Silicon Valley, obviously. Leave that in, editors. The Silicon Valley crowd is going to love it.
So again, the way I solve for this is I don't engage with technical debt as the primary topic. What I engage with is, what is the next generation user experience we're trying to deliver to our customers? And why is our technical debt getting in the way? And so what I want to do is I want to pay off the debt falling forward. So I don't want to rebuild the system we have. I want to rebuild the system we wish we had. And so the way I do that, and we've had a number of episodes about this, is I try to come up with a ideal next generation product, a product that is free of technical constraints, regulatory constraints, financial constraints, time constraints. What is the very best version of this thing that we want to offer to the market? Given everything we've learned, given everything we've built, given everything we've iterated, and that ideal is typically constrained by a number of pragmatic realities, and one of them tends to be technical debt. And so what we do is we pay off the technical debt in that direction. Geez, we want to be able to support infinitely hierarchical nested groups so that we can offer this to massive enterprises with regional offices, with small local offices, with little teams. And we want them all in one hierarchy. All right, great. Let's refactor the account system to support hierarchical groups with hierarchical permissions and whatever, LDAP support or something. And so we're refactoring it forward, not refactoring it in place. And we're also making sure that there is a roadmap for this refactoring. So every piece that is getting refactored, every piece of technical debt that's getting paid off has a deliverable. It has a date and has a business benefit or a user experience benefit or a functionality benefit as well. And so, we can be paying off technical debt all day long, but we're doing it in an effort to deliver a better, more unified, more delightful, more stable product to the market.
Yeah, look, I think I'm inclined to agree, but sometimes you just need to pay back some technical debt because it will allow you to move faster. Like I said, I think you really need to be thinking, what is the bang I get for the buck, right? It could be, hey, if we add tests to this core module, we will be able to increase feature velocity by about 5%. And this is why we think it's the case, right? Because we're no longer afraid to touch that piece of code. We'll get fewer regressions. We'll get fewer bugs as a result of having these tests. And that means we'll have fewer bug fixes. We'll be able to move faster, right? Like this is the sort of business case you want to be making for these things.
Velocity tends to be the softest thing to sell to the business. If you can find a reason better than velocity, you tend to be better off. So outages is a great one. Customer support requests is even better. New feature capability is even better again. And so you always want to try to get as high up that business value stack as possible. Yes, sometimes it just, look, it'll just untangle a knot for us, but that is your least impactful argument to make. Because you always want to be looking for a better argument than that.
That's fair. And then, I think major technical debt payback, you're probably right. Here it's like, let's sort of bundle it with a better piece of value. But I also think there is servicing of technical debt that I would paying back a principal that I would call maintenance and business as usual. I don't think it's valuable to have to make a strong business case for every bit of payback of technical debt. You know it's inevitable, in the knowledge that technical debt is inevitable. But as soon as you can afford to, and I don't mean willingly, delightfully afford to, but as soon as you can afford to, you should be setting aside a portion of your engineering time, a portion of your sprints, whatever you want to call it, to maintenance in the broad sense, which very much includes servicing of technical debt. Within that bucket of time, even within your product teams, within your engineering teams, when you're doing this like adding tests, refactoring, upgrading infrastructure, you should always be prioritizing that by business value, right? You need to be thinking like, what's going to have the most impact on our customers and our business in the long term because we've paid back this technical debt. It's bang for your buck. And as soon as it's just like, hey, I want to do this to scratch an itch, that's where you're in danger of not getting that value. For those who listen to our Reacts episodes, this week we just talked about how it becomes more and more important for people in these technical professions to think as business people, to be entrepreneurial, to provide business value as AI and various tools do more and more of these other things for you. This is where engineers can become incredibly valuable to their business when they can be these trusted business partners rather than people who write code and kind of do what they're told. But to earn that trust, everything you do needs to be made in this sort of deep understanding of business value, and nothing more so than paying back technical debt, because it is frankly always going to be somewhat opaque to the rest of the business.
And now implied in this, and hopefully it's obvious, but I'm going to state it anyway, you need to partner with your friendly neighborhood product manager to be able to understand, articulate, prioritize this business value. So a mistake I see a lot is, the engineers are kind of quietly working on technical debt in the background. It's not on the roadmap. It's buried. It's done on the sly. You should work with your product manager to figure out what is the most high priority, high impact technical debt to pay off, and then how to articulate that as business value on the roadmap and to, time it all correctly. It should not be invisible work that is not accounted for.
Yes.
And then one last point I'll make, you used the phrase business case, Yaniv. I just want to be cautious here. If your engineering team is having to make a business case for every damn thing you do, then you are failing. You should empower your product managers and product teams to have a mission and to go execute that mission. When we talk about expressing things as business value, I'm not talking about having to go through a big, litigation to explain it. Just as it's on the roadmap, you describe it and, deliver X to reduce outages by Y is enough for the business team to understand that you're focused on your mission and you're getting shit done.
I agree. When I say business case, what I mean is you should be thinking about why the business should be making this investment, not you need to go through a heavy weight, capital B, capital C business case. But actually, I just wanted to build on what you were saying about working with product management, right? I think, you slightly represent the product perspective. I slightly represent the engineering perspective. So this is great. I completely agree. This cannot be dark matter that engineering is doing on the sly, on the side. It needs to involve the product manager. The time needs to be set aside. It needs to be, again, in the sprint or on your Kanban board or whatever. It needs to be actual work units. And I think for the product manager, it's really important to have an open mind, to be curious about technical debt, to understand what's going on there, and to not be an obstacle to making these worthwhile investments as time passes. Because, I think a common anti-pattern can be the product manager only really cares about product. And that's why the engineers end up kind of doing it on the sly. And that is a dysfunction in what should be one of the closest relationships in the business is between product management and engineering. So from both sides of, that potential divide, make sure it doesn't become a divide. Be honest, be open, be curious, and collaborate on doing this thing, which is just a really important thing as part of the business, like everything else that you're doing.
That sounds awesome. Yaniv, I think and I feel like I've thoroughly understood what is technical debt, the common causes and types of technical debt, understanding its relationship to financial debt. I think that's a really useful metaphor, by the way, and how to make decisions about paying it off and when, where, and how. Now, Yaniv, if people want to learn more about tech debt and how you might be helpful with that, how can they reach you on the internet?
Yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn. I love connections on LinkedIn anyway, but once you do that, feel free to DM me. I offer various services on the sort of engineering side to help companies really level up. I'd say, especially that commercial side of how you do engineering as a partnership with the business, with the customers, rather than kind of just as a delivery function. So that's what I do. Feel free to hit me up. Love to get connection requests. Now, Chris, how about you? We talked about the fact that you have been helping a company with exactly this problem and sounding like you're doing an amazing job getting the business aligned. So if people want to know more about you, your thinking, or the kind of work you do, where do you go?
You can learn more about my work over at chrissaad.com/advisory or follow my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. Otherwise, all over social media at Chris Saad. All right, Yaniv, another great convo as always.
Absolutely. See you in the next one. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.